Healers, do you know what your baseline is when you are working with your clients? So, baseline is your normal, centered, rooted defaults in terms of your own behavioral and perceptual norms. So, that is what I call your baseline. And you need to know what your baseline is when you're working with your clients. It also helps in any relationship to know what your baseline is. You can read more about what we're going to be talking about in my book, Savage Awakening, in chapter 6, called The Metaphysics of the Self. That gives a pretty detailed explanation of this phenomena, but I'm going to talk with you about it here because you need to know. So, what happens is when we work with a client, all of us have, let's call it a metaphysical field around us, or a field, a biosphere, if you will, around us. Some people call it the aura. I'm not sure that's exactly what this is. But what happens is that when any of us interact with another person, they have particular things in their field that are based in their experiences and their expectations and their story. So they have sort of imprints in their field of what is normal for them. And when we are not exceptionally rooted and centered, and sometimes even when we are, what happens is someone else's field will activate particular behaviors and perceptions in our own field that then cause us to behaviorally enact whatever their story is. I'll give you an example of this. So, this is the true story of how I first learned about the importance of baselines and how crucial they are. So, this was probably 20 something years ago. I was working with a client. It was our first session. And as we began to connect, I noticed that I became increasingly critical of this person. I could not stop criticizing this person. Now, my baseline, as intense as I am, is not to be excessively critical of people. I can certainly, do that like any of us can. But this was just over the top, to the point where I was noticing that it was happening and I couldn't stop. I couldn't control what was coming out of my mouth no matter how hard I tried. It was like I was trapped inside myself playing something out with this person. We had an email exchange after that session. They came back in and I said, "Hey, can we talk about what happened?" I found out that the whole reason this person came to see me was because every single place in their life, for their entire life, they are constantly criticized no matter what they do. And I went, whoa, something is happening here. So when you learn what your baseline is, it starts to become a kind of revelation tool with your clients whenever you deviate from the norm of whatever your baseline is. So when we deviate from the norm and it's quite noticeable, we can then understand the lived experience our client is having through behaviorally what we are compelled to enact with them. And this is one of the reasons becoming rooted and centered as a practitioner is so incredibly important. Otherwise, without having any idea, we can be playing out someone else's story in our session with them. And very rarely will a client tell you, "This is a pattern I encounter. This is something that doesn't work for me." They're so used to it that, of course, it's happening in their healing session. Of course, it's happening with their therapist, their doctor, their energy worker, their massage practitioner, their acupuncturist, whatever. Of course, it's playing out again. So it's very important on our end to tend to baseline so that we don't keep reinforcing someone else's feeling of inevitability that they will be treated or perceived in a particular way. So that's baseline. And becoming rooted and centered is incredibly important as a practitioner for a million reasons. But this is one of the biggies, is that you need to have a baseline that allows you to feel the impulse to be reactive to someone else's metaphysics, but allows you to resist that impulse and notice and have conscious conversation about those impulses to see, is this something that is actually alive for them, or is it just something I need to tend to? So we can be fully accountable in a very caring way about the experiences someone else is having with us. But it also can be very relieving to speak to it with clients, because it becomes something that they can understand as a patterning that can be changed or addressed, not as an inevitability that they themselves have to resolve. So it takes the burden from the individual having to heal themselves or deal with their issues, and it puts it into an interpersonal space where we are both accountable and responsive to this phenomenon. So it's not just the client's job to deal with it. And then what we can do is we can actually give them language for how they can begin to incorporate this concept of the metaphysics of the self and how we activate certain tendencies in one another because of our invisible storied metaphysics that we carry. We can actually give our clients scripts, give them tools to help them begin to incorporate this into other relationships that they have, particularly ones like with an employer or with a partner or with a family member, to be able to say, hey, this is a pattern that's in my field, and I would like us to consciously come up with agreements of how we can tag team this pattern so that it doesn't keep infiltrating this space. Because even when it is very minor, for somebody who has lived that experience and they're burdened or trapped by that experience, even those little minor metaphysical compliances, we might call them, with their field and with their story, even in minor ways, can become extremely significant, because what it does is it begins to evidentially and experientially build the case that they are screwed. It builds the case that this is just how their life is. It's something they have to learn how to accommodate or deal with. And they're always going to be isolated or lonely or not seen accurately or continually trapped or cursed or whatever that experience might be for them. So baselines, know what your baseline is and pay keen attention to when you're deviating. It doesn't mean, if there's a deviation, it doesn't mean it's coming from your client. And this is why we need to get rooted and centered, so that we don't get tossed around by what's in us or what's outside of us, that we can be rooted and centered and stay very steady and be very clear with the people that we're working with. All right. I hope that's helpful. If you want more information, Savage Awakening, Initiatory Paths of the Dragon Mother, Chapter 6, The Metaphysics of the Self. It can be very worth it to get more information about this and some of the things that you can do about it. Thanks. I hope this was helpful. Have a great day.